start talking about some different ideas or thoughts or attitudes that there might be about suicide, and I want you to think about them. The first one is anyone can be at risk of suicide. So what do you guys think? Yay or nay? Yeah. So the myth or stereotype is that there's only certain types of people that think about suicide, but we know that's not the case. But when we think about that, we miss so many people. We see signs that someone's showing us, and we say, no, so-and-so is not that kind of person that would think about suicide. What about this one? Suicide is wrong. Okay, so I have some yes. I have some in the middles. I'm getting some it depends, right? Depends on the circumstances. It's not a black and white issue, right? There's a lot of gray area with this one. Some of the things that might be driving the way that you feel could be religious values. Typically, religions tell us that suicide's wrong, right? Ethical. There are definitely ethical implications here, especially terminal illnesses.
I feel like it's wrong for people left behind, and they feel that way for the person at the time. It's not wrong for them. So as somebody, if you're thinking of yourself and what you would feel, that's different than
And I'm not here to change your mind, and I'm definitely not here to say that suicide is right. It's just something that you should be mindful of. How do you feel about these things? Because our attitudes impact our ability to identify someone who might be struggling and our willingness to help them. Yeah, assisted suicide is another hot topic, an issue that brings up a lot of ethical questions. The thing with this statement, suicide is wrong, is that it minimizes the complexities of suicide. I would never tell someone that suicide is wrong, but I will tell them that there are other options that they have and help them to see those other options. There is a freedom of choice issue too. So, all of these answers that you guys supplied just go to show how complex this issue really is. What about suicide is selfish? It's a common one, right? So I'm getting a lot of it depends. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So a lot of times people think that the person who is thinking about suicide or didn't die about suicide isn't thinking about their loved ones, and that's not the case. Oftentimes they feel like a burden to others. They wrongly think that their loved ones would be better off without them here. What about people who talk about suicide or taking his or her life are not serious? Definitely not, right? The underlying myth or stereotype here is that people who talk about suicide are just attention seeking. No, they're asking for your help in the way that they know how. Exactly. So I'm a bit of a history nerd, so I looked into the history of stigma. And it actually comes from a Greek word, stigmatos, which means mark or puncture. So in ancient Greek society, they actually used to mark slaves so that they could be identified and their position as a lesser being in society could be solidified. Yeah. So then I also started looking at the historical perceptions of mental illness and how that came to evolve, and thinking about how those perceptions came down from generation to generation. And the way that they used to explain mental illness was through supernatural forces. So there was one theory that mental illness was caused by an unbalance of four humors in the body. And then there were explanations that people were witches or they were possessed by demons. And then what this did. Oh, yes. Yeah, Freud. Not going to touch that one. But what this did was it really dehumanized people. And then when they started opening up hospitals and removing people from the home, one of the most infamous hospitals was Bedlam in England. And they would literally chain people to the walls, and they would allow people to pay to come in and just like see these people as entertainment. So I really think that's the roots of the stigma, even though things have improved. I think those things definitely influenced the overall societal stigma that we see today. So there's a few different types of stigma. Two here that I'm going to talk about are self-stigma and public stigma. So public stigma is the stigma that society holds. It starts with a cue. So maybe you see somebody on the train who is talking, but there's no one that they're talking to. That's your cue. So your stigmatizing belief might be that person is crazy. So the attitude could be crazy people are dangerous. And then the discrimination could be to get up and isolate that person and move away from them. Stigma doesn't only exist in society. People begin to internalize the way that they've been treated. So that cue could be that they know that they're talking to someone other people don't see. That person gets up and walks away, they get off the train. The general belief they might have is that something's wrong with me. Crazy people are dangerous. And then they begin to accept the discrimination and the treatment that they receive. So it's really important to recognize that stigma is not just like this cloud hovering over our society that we need to try to get away from. It's really impacting people on an internal level. So what does stigma look like? Does anyone have an experience with stigma that they would like to share? Yes.
When I was in college, I made the mistake of talking about how I got into some engagement several times, and people started to kind of move away. Not right then, but people started in general over time started to kind of distance themselves from it, and they thought, crazy, you know, lightning bolts going through your head, unfrozen cuckoo, and that kind of stuff.
Mm.
So that depression.
Thank you for sharing.
And it's also where you build deep depression as you then start to alternative method, how people are able to use it easy to recover.
Mm-hmm. I think I saw it. Yes. Thank you.
Waking up in another town, not knowing you're there.
Mm.
Being told I'm a difficult or not myself, I'm now considered a non-compliant physical patient. And that's terrifying. I love the practice.
Thank you. We'll take one or two more.
I went to go find a new psychiatrist, and when I told him my history, that I have multiple diagnoses and that I have a history of multiple hospitalizations, he said that he would refuse to give treatment, that I was too complicated for him to handle at his level. Oh, wow. Excuse me. I don't think he would have funded it.
I think one of the best, one of the best discriminations I heard was the story that Dr. Sharpstein told about a group home where they were trying to get started and the community was fighting against it because of discrimination. They were showing for these people who needed good homes. And they were all people living small and they were needing a place and they kept having to move where they were going to put them. That is clear stigma.
Yeah, there's a lot of discrimination that could look like housing, refusing to house people that have a known mental illness, refusing to employ people or honor accommodations for people with mental illness. It's a huge issue. Refusal to treat, someone brought that up. There are certain diagnoses that I even hear, yes, sir.
I'm a psychiatrist. I just want to share that we too have what the famous psychologist Irving Goffman called courtesy stigma that goes through our profession. One day I'm going to write my memoirs about what it was like being a single man as a psychiatrist, revealing that in my dates. And the kind of stigma that generated, and stigma that one continues to get to this day. And in fact, it's a problem in medical school. As you know, we have a manpower, person power shortage. And, my medical school class is 2% going to psychiatry. And there are many reasons for that have to do with the stigmatization of being a psychiatrist. And the discouragements, and as well as the way in which the system treats us, not just the general public, that make people reluctant to go into psychiatry. So I just want to let you all know that we share stigma on one side of the equation.
To his point, I always am reluctant to share that I'm a therapist because then that means people either dump and unload on you, like when you're trying to get a manicure or a massage. Or I always get, are you psychoanalyzing me? And I'm like, no, I don't do psychoanalysis. I do EMDR and person-centered therapy, so no. It's always the most inopportune times. But yeah, as a therapist who works with other behavioral health professionals, there's a whole host of diagnoses that people unfortunately don't want to treat or try to refer out if they come in. Even just in my graduate training, hearing the way that certain diagnoses were talked about, like, oh, if you get a borderline, you're gonna know. They're gonna be calling your phone and encroaching all of your boundaries. And I've treated a few people that are living with borderline personality disorder, and that was not the case. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so mockery is another way that stigma can show up. Inaccurate representation. So a couple years ago, Walmart actually sold mental patient costumes, and someone had to bring up to them that that's not really a good idea. This newspaper, Get the Violent Crazies Off of Our Streets, this kind of language is just really stigmatizing. And again, the inaccurate representation of people living with mental illness being responsible for mass shootings is another way that stigma is showing up in our society right now. So here's a quote that I pulled. I was at the hospital trying to get admitted. The social worker looked at my chart and saw borderline personality disorder and automatically thought I was there to seek attention. I explained that I had a plan and intent to take my own life, and she dismissed it. I got discharged, so I called my therapist's office on-call number, and they told me to go back to the hospital. I went, and the social worker was so mad. She said there was no way she was going to admit someone who wasn't an imminent threat to herself. She discharged me again. I ended up overdosing that night and was hospitalized for a week. I can't believe that she was able to muster up the courage to go back to the hospital after having that experience, but to be discharged twice was incredible. Yeah. Unfortunately, it comes from the people who are in helping positions at times. Anytime you disagree with someone who knows about your mental illness, the first thing out of their mouth is, "Oh my God, are you off your meds?" Or, "I think you need new meds." It's infuriating. I already feel so out of place as it is. Someone who supposedly loves you should never react this way. There's a song by Matchbox 20 called Unwell, and I think it really speaks to the individual's perception of stigma. Here's a quote from the song. "I'm talking to myself in public, dodging glances on the train, and I know they've all been talking about me. I can hear them whisper, and it makes me think there must be something wrong with me." So we've talked a lot about what stigma looks like for general mental health. Another group that experiences stigma is suicide loss survivors. So a lot of times what people report after losing a loved one to suicide is feeling blame and judgment from others, feelings of annoyance that suicide disrupts their lives or that they have to deal with it, being pitied. People are afraid of suicide contagion, that they're going to catch suicide. Feelings of discomfort being around the family after the suicide. People won't come and talk to you. I actually was home last week, and my cousin disclosed to me that a friend of hers died by suicide recently, and she was asking me for advice on how to interact with the family. And I said, interact with them as if you would if it was any other cause of death. People are already going to be uncomfortable talking to the family. They don't know what to say, but be there, show the family that you are supportive, even if you don't know what to say. Sometimes your presence is enough. But don't isolate them any further than they already are. People won't come to the wake or funeral. Maybe you're not allowed to be buried in a certain cemetery because you died by suicide, or certain establishments won't host the wake or funeral because of the cause of death. Neighbors gossip. They start thinking, what is so wrong with that family that that person decided to die, to take their own life? People tell you to get over it and move on. The workplace is unsupportive. I mean, how long is bereavement leave? 3 days? At most, maybe. We know the grief process is a lot longer than that. There's few support groups available. People judge and they're hypocritical of the family. They start to mistrust them. Someone brought this up, phrases that we use in commonplace language that are actually really stigmatizing. This weather is so bipolar. You're so OCD. When people say that one, I really I'm triggered. You're being hysterical. They're so psycho. I'm so depressed. I'm going to have a panic attack. Stop being so paranoid. I'm so addicted. This makes me want to kill myself. When we use these phrases, even though we don't think about the connotation that's attached to them, we minimize the impact that these conditions have on the people living with them. We make it commonplace, and then it makes it really easy that when someone living with this speaks up about their experience, it's really easy to minimize it and tell them to get over it, or that it's not that hard. So how can we check our attitudes about suicide? What biases do we hold? When you think about the word suicide, what comes up for you? It might not be pleasant. That's okay, we're human. But to know that it's unpleasant and unhelpful and to leave it that way is irresponsible. If you think that people thinking about suicide are selfish or weak or seeking attention, manipulating, they can't be helped, I encourage you to think about that. Where did you get those beliefs? Where did they come from? Why is that coming up for you? What information do you need so that you can have a more neutral or endearing perspective when you're interacting with someone who's battling suicidal thoughts or behaviors? One way that you can start helping to combat the stigma around suicide is being mindful of your language. Language is really important. Mental disorders are not adjectives. Committed suicide conveys that someone committed a crime. It just perpetuates the shame that already exists around suicide. Successful suicide, failed attempt, and unsuccessful suicide imply that suicide was a desired outcome, and suicide is never a desired outcome. So instead of committed suicide or successful suicide, you just say died by suicide. That's how they died, like someone died from cancer, right? For failed attempt, you just say that they had a suicide attempt. They attempted suicide. Same thing with unsuccessful suicide. It's so easy to look over how the bigger meaning that our words have when we say them. Some consequences of stigma: unwillingness to seek help. Why try? I'm so messed up. No one's going to be able to fix me. Low self-esteem, withdrawing and isolating, the fear of being found out, rejection and being excluded by others, and discrimination. And we all know that these things just further increase the risk of suicide. They're counterproductive to our mission. This is another one that just popped up recently. I've been seeing a lot on social media about medication shaming, telling people they don't need their meds. You can do it. I did it. I want everyone to do the same. The forest is an antidepressant. Your prescription is a lifelong addiction. This has to stop. If people have positive experiences on medication and it helps them achieve and live the life that they want, leave them alone. It costs $0 to mind your own business. So how can we fight stigma? Stigma campaigns, education, being mindful about the language we use, and incorporating lived experience. Here's some stigma campaigns launched by the Mental Health Association of Maryland. I really like this one. Why don't you just try harder? To the guy in the wheelchair. Isn't it insane how society diminishes people with mental illness? Heart disease, just another excuse for lazy people not to work. A lot of people get cancer because they just can't deal with reality. It's funny, right? The play on words, but how many times has someone with a mental illness been told this? I'm gonna share a video with you that I really like, and I started using this video when I worked with the National Guard, where stigma is so present. The truth is that we don't treat mental illness like we treat physical illness. And our mind health is just as important as our physical health. And I really think that this video does a nice job of depicting that. Hopefully it works. Okay, don't worry, I came with a backup plan.
Really, a lot of people are worse off than you know.
I'm getting tired of hearing about this.
Oh, honey, snap out of it.
You're kind of dragging me down.
Why don't you just go outside, get some sunshine, you'll be fine.
Can we stop with the pity party?
So anyone interested in that video, it's available on Vimeo if you Google Hope for Depression, snap out of it. But I really like showing that to people. And the reactions that I get is, I am so angry. Like, why would anyone talk to her like that? Not realizing that they've said those same exact things to someone struggling with mental health. But it's a good conversation starter, and it's a good way to highlight a concept that some people might have difficulty grasping. Oh, so now it's gonna work on the slide. So our language, there is right and wrong language to use when talking about mental health. It's hurtful to say the mentally ill, psycho, crazy, lunatic, or to characterize someone by their disorder. We don't call someone bipolar or schizophrenic. It's a person who is living with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They are a person. They are not a condition that's in a textbook. They're crazy. They're deranged. They're nuts. No, they're not. Again, they suffer from depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. Why do they have to suffer? They're living their lives.
One I heard at one point was, only once in my life is depressing. You're a person described as a depressing. Which sounds even worse than saying bipolar or schizophrenic, but it just shows why calling someone depressing seems really.
It sounds terrible. It sounds like you're making other people depressed.
Yes, as the same with the other elements.
Yeah. It is demeaning. Yes.
I've seen anti-stigma campaigns for years. Has there been any research as to how effective they are?
I would have to get back to you on that. I think it's something that's hard to measure, but I have seen research about launching public awareness campaigns and using evidence-based techniques that help to change attitudes over time. We just know that it takes a long time for attitudes to change. So I would say, and I don't know, but my experience is that I have seen anti-stigma campaigns over the last several years. I've been seeing them increasingly. I don't know that we'll see the outcomes for several more years. The other thing that I think is really important is incorporating lived experience. So on our commission, we had a seat for someone who was a family member that lost someone to suicide, but we didn't have a seat for someone who survived a suicide attempt. And while both are equally valuable, we're missing a huge voice in the work that we do, so we added that seat. Without lived experience, we wouldn't know that people who are thinking about suicide are ambivalent. So it's really important that we ensure people with lived experience are represented. Listening to people, hearing their story to understand is a good way to combat stigma. It's easy to make up these stereotypes, these attitudes, these thoughts in our head about what someone living with a mental health condition is like, or someone who thinks about suicide is like, until we have to interact with them and see them as a person and hear their story and understand what their experience has been. So I encourage you, if you don't know someone who has lived experience, to seek someone out. There are panels on this. NAMI has a program called In Our Own Voice. Educate yourselves, interact with them, see what it's like to live with a mental illness. If you're a representative on a commission or chair and you're working towards a public health issue or any health condition, and you don't have someone on your advisory board that lives with that condition or has been impacted, you're doing public health wrong. You need to make sure that you're incorporating lived experience and their voice. You can't work with a community without knowing what their thoughts and feelings on these things are. It reminds me of the endocrinologist saying that you're a non-compliant patient when they probably have never experienced depression in their life. They don't know what it's like. They're sitting and trying to tell you to take this medication without listening to, I can't even get out of bed some days. We can't implement interventions that are effective without problem solving with the community that we're trying to reach. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions.
I have kind of maybe a stigma one. You're talking a lot about stigma and about suicidal ideation, and I know that's what you kind of specialize in. The one thing I even find with colleagues that helps the therapist, we don't talk about homicidal ideation at all.
Mm-hmm.
No one talks about destigmatizing homicidal ideation, what that looks like, how scary it is. I have clients who will talk about suicide like that, but as soon as you start talking about homicidal ideation, people laugh.
Mm-hmm.
People think that it's not real, that they're dangerous, all of those things, and I just didn't know, if you've heard anything about any either research or destigmatizing homicidal ideation as well as suicide.
I haven't. I know that like my sort of soapbox is I always see homicidal ideation and suicidal ideation lumped together, and it really bothers me because I think it just further stigmatizes suicide. But again, that's just not my area, so I'm sorry that I don't have anything to offer, but thank you for bringing it up. Yes.
Back years ago when I was in art school, I was extremely depressed. And I was very fortunate to have a wonderful therapist, but I had lots of thoughts of suicide, and I had stored huge amounts of medication. I was reading scholarly books on suicide. That stored amount of medication that I had probably prevented me from committing suicide at the time because it was like, well, things get really bad, I have an out. And if I didn't have that stored medication, maybe I would have done something because I might have felt back against the wall with no out.
So to you, it felt safe. So to you, it felt safe to have that. It kept you from becoming hopeless.
That kept me from committing suicide. I mean, years later, I still on and off would struggle with depression, but not to the extent that I experienced it back in my early 20s. And I don't even know whatever happened over that. No idea.
Yes.
I don't know if anyone here read it, but there was an article that came out, I think it was a few months ago. The woman who wrote it experienced suicidal ideation, which she referred to as passive suicidal ideation on a regular basis. And it was a really informative article about they've never made an attempt and maybe they're not stockpiling anything, but it's still affecting their day-to-day lives and it's not something they feel they can talk about. And I wonder if, you've experienced working with people who are, I hate the word high functioning. I know that's not the term, but that's what a lot of blue people use. But it's people who are, living their day-to-day lives, and still struggling with this.
Yeah, I do. I think of suicidal ideation as a spectrum because there certainly are people that live with chronic suicidal ideation and they don't have any intent. And then there are people that do have intent to act on the suicidal thoughts. The chronic suicidal ideation, it is difficult for people to live with, and I do feel like a lot of times they get left out of the conversation because they're not in immediate crisis. And the way that I see that show up in practice is sort of like I'm driving my car down the road, and what if I swerved my car into the other car coming head on? Or I'm washing dishes, and what if I picked up this knife and harmed myself with it? So I would argue you still safety plan with those individuals. You talk about how frequent those thoughts are, how intense they are, how distressing they are to them, and you work with them around those thoughts and what to do when they come up. But it's really important there to also assess intent, because intent is a key indicator of future suicide attempts. Not always. There is no one single factor, right? It's usually a multitude of factors coming together that feel unbearable to someone. One big one that we see is relationship issues, financial problems, bullying, things like that, as well as having mental health conditions can certainly be a risk factor for suicidal ideation. Yes.
In my support group, we had an interesting discussion on a child only going to mom to say they were suicidal and never saying it to dad. And so dad keeps saying, oh, he just knows the suicide. What's your opinion when there's only one person that they keep telling the truth, but the other people don't see them as being suicidal?
Maybe they feel safe with that person. It would be my guess. I mean, it's a limited amount of information, but my guess would be mom does something that makes them feel safe. Mm-hmm. I have the same questions. Do they know what they're doing? I hope that it's ignorance and that they don't, in fact, know what they're doing and still continue to do it anyway. But there was a group actually that just recently released guidelines for the entertainment industry on portraying mental illness and suicide. So there are national organizations that are showing the media, we're watching what you're doing. What you're doing isn't helpful to the work that we're trying to do and the society that we're trying to live in. And there are people watching and holding you accountable. Sure. Thank you, guys.
I want to, before we say goodbye and thank you to Janelle, I just wanted to mention a few things before we say goodbye. Several things. One is there's a lot of ways people can get involved, both in reducing stigma as well as in doing advocacy, telling people, having the conversations is one of the first things, making it safe to have conversations, not just with people who have these issues, but also with other people in the world, because if we don't say something, no one will. But I also wanted to say that there is, we've done a number of advocacy around a number of different things, including the ERPO law and otherwise unfortunately known in other places as the red flag law. But Janelle's office brought gun locks at our request. They brought more today, I believe, hundreds more. So those of you who want to are doing outreach in your community and you want to have some gun locks on your tables, let us know. We've got them. That is not the purpose of this conversation, but I wanted to be sure you knew, because we don't want to take them back with us if you can use them. And then finally, I wanted to say there are innumerable ways you can get involved in official and unofficial anti-stigma campaigns. And NAMI itself at the national office has great fact sheets on what to say when there are mass shootings or when there are violence episodes, when there's a suicide in the entertainment industry. Also has guidelines for entertainment industry and for decision makers. Take advantage of them, okay? And then there is something called the Stigma-Free campaign that more people sign up for it, put the sticker on, have that conversation. NAMI has a Stigma-Free campaign, but there's lots of other ways you can get involved. This woman is amazing. So